Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Freakazoid, episodes 1 through 5 of the first season. Man, when watching this show, I was honestly blown away by it just because of how, like, it was trying to basically say that this show was probably like a tax write-off for Warner Brothers, and they just needed to get another show out there. So they were just like, well, hey, like, uh, if that is the plan kind of thing, well, then we're just gonna like do whatever we want and have fun with it. And it really just kind of shows within this episode of like a lot of fourth wall breaking where we just have it to where Freakazoid just like breaks the fourth wall and goes into the cameraman and hugs all the kids who are actors and so on and so forth. Even though this is an animated thing, it's just hilarious. I would love a live action thing of this show or just a movie. Overall, this kind of would be very much compared to The Mask, I think, as far as character wise. Where could you go to watch this show? I've been watching it on Movie Pro. I think luckily all the episodes are correct in there, and you can go in and watch this show. We have it to where the origin of this. Well, let me also kind of mention, like, for people that probably like actors like a Ryan Reynolds or a Jim Carrey or Rainn Wilson. Of course, people will probably know him as Dwight from The Office. Uh, I could see when listening to this character, like I could really see any three of those people probably eventually playing Freakazoid at some point. Because I thought that the character was just so wild and so interesting. Going on into these first 5 episodes, like I was like, you know what? I'm having a lot of fun watching this show, and it's a very goofy concept. We have kind of like a Looney Tunes approach to a man being a hero, and really they don't even care to really like. They give you a quick, they give you a really quick origin story within the intro. But here's also the funny thing. They also just like randomly do a bunch of stuff. Like even like the theme song has just like, well, hey, look, there's chimps, and like then there's like a picture of a chimp, or like we have a Freakazoid like hugging chimps, or like we end up having Freakazoid just adding in like certain clips from a show or something with that. We end up having Freakazoid breaking fourth walls a lot, to where we end up having Freakazoid like stopping filming to really make it to where he's making fun of the narrator consistently, where the narrator is like narrating something, and we end up having Freakazoid like going and hugging the animated version of the narrator, and then also he's going and he's like, "Hey director, hey yeah," and then he ends up like hugging all the young kids. He's like, "Well yeah, like if anything, all these kids are gonna be like these kids are really fun, and like eventually we'll meet again later on, and we'll hang out." And like we end up having this Freakazoid show going into such a variety. I was like, okay, like so the Freakazoid thing is gonna be the main thing, right? But then no, like they go and do these like other skits that I think are just as hilarious. Like we have this Lord Bravery character, which I thought that a lot of scenes there were just hilarious. Uh, if anything, there's probably going to be some stuff that I'm probably going to forget or leave out, just because of how wide of a variety that these first 5 episodes had. I could have been just better off to just review one episode per, and then just, but like I was just so glued to this show, like I could not stop watching it. And so I was like, well, yeah, like, but how many episodes should I go into before I realize that, like, I've gone too far? because that's how good that this show was for me. Like, I thought that this show was hilarious. There was times where you would just have this person that just comes in here and has a monologue and then all of a sudden like shouts some absurdity. Like, there's an entire episode dedicated to uh kids screaming at their TV through an entire episode, which I found to be hilarious. So with that said, yeah, these episodes are really fun. There's like three parters, I think, through most of these episodes, to where there's like little skits where we have it to where we all of a sudden just have like a completely different story going on, and we don't know how long that will actually last. Um, I don't know why they had to like put in a variety like thing. Like, you could probably sell, like, I guess they were trying to sell other shows within this show because tax write off. Like, they were trying to think of like things that could probably be a commercial thing. Like, I think whoever was probably working on the show was probably trying to do like a portfolio like thing, to where, again, since for Warner Brothers this is like a tax write off, uh basically they were just like, okay, well, whoever we get to work on this show is going to be like a person that's going to be like well rounded after this whole show is over. And so maybe they're probably like, hey, let's get the least experienced person on this totem pole because it's a tax write off, to just get them on some consistent things under their belt. But yeah, I really thought that this show was really fun. I like the fact that they realistically didn't care about like how this character was to look. They just kind of like randomly like put a bunch of stuff together for this character, I think, and they probably also like the intro was like really funny. It was like the intro kind of sets you up for the entire show. It basically tells you, it's like, dude, like we don't care, but it's okay. Like, there could be something else on TV, but hey, like, you're still here, you're still watching, so thank you. Uh, I thought that that was the funniest thing going on in the show, was just the fact that, uh, like, and I think at some point, I think on the first episode, we end up having Freakazoid mentioning how like everybody was really proud about what they're doing on the first episode, where it's like, yeah, and everyone was proud about all the bizarre, weird, and uh, goofy stuff that we did. So yeah, just overall a fun thromp, because really it was just, I couldn't wait to get more Freakazoid like episodes. Like, I didn't care for all the other like variety stuff that they were giving on there, except for Lord Bravery. I think like that was a that was a skit that was consistently working. We also had certain skits that were just wildly like tossed in there, which I thoroughly enjoyed. When Freakazoid was trying to figure out like what the WP standed for, which I thought was hilarious. But also, we end up having it to where there was a man that came in a dialogue, and then he's like, I think I'm sitting on a pen, and then, and then he ends up just leaving off or something like that. That like, anyways, but this show is hilarious. If you've never seen it before, definitely go out of your way to find it, check it out, and watch it. Again, for a lot of people who like shows like The Mask, or like movies like The Mask also has like an animated series. Uh, for those of people that also just like a show where they just kind of throw the kitchen sink at a show because it's just bizarre and it's an odd approach, but it's also really fun. Uh, we have it to where For a lot of people, this could probably also remind them of The Tick and all those kinds of other like goofy humor like shows that uh, really is very much fun. It's like this show is so much fun. I can't wait to comb through more episodes, and so hopefully this goes well. Or otherwise, I'll just be like, yeah, I'm just gonna keep reviewing this regardless because I want to hope that I can keep going back into the show and watching it. So I think it's about that time to go into spoiler time and then go into yeah, I'm gonna need a little bit of help on this one because I have here the character names of certain characters. If I kind of go, I don't remember who exactly any of these characters are. So by and large, let's go into that double five time territory and to ultimately go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil. That was a delay. That was a little. That was a little bit of a delay. Let's go into spoilers. So I would say enjoy the show. Go on a Movie Pro or Ultra Play, HD movie, whichever. Go into any movie app that you could dare in fact watch this for free. If you can't, then I would probably just say like, well, go on to YouTube or go on to like I'm sure you could probably find this somewhere that probably has you to probably have to probably forcibly pay for a certain amount of money. But this show is actually worth watching. If you have the money, you can probably pick up the entire series and just like binge watch it if that's what you really wanted to do. So I tell you, let's get into spoilers. So, in the very first episode, like I said, I had a cheat sheet prepared, which is basically just the descriptions of the episodes, and then I was going to go for there. So, we had it to where in the very beginning of this, we have telling us that Freakazoid is a character named Dexter Douglas. It seems that Dexter Douglas had been consistently typing away at his computer, and he ends up getting sucked into his computer like Tron, and he ends up becoming a superhero, and then ends up getting sucked out of said computer. And so instead of him just wielding a mask of sorts where he just puts that on and just like we end up having like the Freakazoid being like just like hands down like very familiar to me with the mask. So just the intro is just like if the intro doesn't sell you on the show, then it like you won't be interested. But anyways, so first off, we have Freakazoid giving us a bizarrish, like, 5-day forecast. Of course, he like goes in and mentions like how like all of these kinds of weather things are happening, and then eventually he ends up like going in and like showcasing us that he's actually just a weatherman, which I thought I was like okay, like I'm a little confused about what was going on, especially like the first introduction of here, but. Then eventually we get to the next section, which was the Dance of Doom, which so we end up finding out that there is a villainous character called Cave Guy that is on the loose. And so this Cave Guy is a blue skinned like uh, normal, like hulkish like guy, but he's wearing like a caveman garb, and so we end up finding out that this guy is ruthless and angry and all kinds of things. And to where you would think that oh, like cave guy, so he's like a caveman, and so like he's just going to act like a caveman, and that's what his shtick is. No, Um, we have Cave Guy, who also is this brute, but then he is also very educational as well. He's very intelligent as well. So he's like this oxymoron thing going on. So we end up having this caveman or cave guy going on the loose to heading to this dance. And so we end up having seemingly Dexter having his parents ask him, like, well, hey, like, Dexter, are you going to go to your school dance? And Dexter's like, no, I just want to stay at home and just do things with my computer. And we end up having his mother going, like, oh, well, that's really sad. And then she ends up, like, closing the door and just. So we end up having Dexter, I guess, giving into like traditional things and whatever was school. And so Dexter tries to desperately call any popular girl in his high school, and every single one of them have some kind of excuse, whether it's a rational excuse or it gets completely or totally bizarre. We end up having it to where uh Dexter was told by like some girls that they basically like, oh no, I'm doing my hair that night, or oh, like I'm getting something removed that night, or oh, like I have several things going on simultaneously at the same time, and I just don't think I'll be able to go. And so, or we have another girl that it's like, dude, I wouldn't have been caught dead with you at the dance because Dexter was just unpopular. So, and funny enough, we have not Dexter, but eventually we have Freakazoid, who seems to eventually get a girlfriend nonetheless. So we have Dexter, who is to go like, well, I need to go, and I need to go to this dance anyways because, like, you know, I guess I'll just go as Freakazoid. Like, that'll be fine. And so we end up having Dexter going, and whenever he is to change from Dexter to Freakazoid, he ends up just saying freak out, and then he just changes lightning ways or tornado ways into Freakazoid. And then eventually, if Freakazoid wanted to turn back to Dexter, he just says freak in. Freakin'? Okay. So we have this character who is to go off onto making his way to this dance as Freakazoid. And we end up having a Sergeant Mike Cosgrove, uh, this police officer, pulling Freakazoid to the side, and he's like, hey, buddy, how about you and me go out for a mint? And Freakazoid's like, you know what? Like, I could go for a mint. And so we have this cave guy that is wreaking havoc at this dance, and we have just this police officer and Freakazoid yeah, like I really enjoyed that mint, Sergeant Mike Cosgrove, and so on and so forth. And like, this is always to just set up that this Sergeant Mike Cosgrove is going to tell Freakazoid that there is a trouble in the town. And so we end up having consistently that this guy is going to delay telling Freakazoid that there is a problem in the city, and then Freakazoid is the only one that can solve it. So I thought that this part was like hilarious. I'm like, oh, okay, here we go again. Like, we have it to where the sergeant like consistently goes in and like has them on some like side journey, and I thought that that was hilarious. So, and at some point, like, I don't think it happens every single time, but I honestly think that it should have. And also, it was kind of hilarious that the show was seeing this menacing cave guy like character, and they were thinking, well, there's only one there's only one hero that could take on this villainous person, and we have this like shadow of like Batman holding up a guy, and it's like, well, it's not Batman because he's on another network. And then like Batman's like, huh? He's like, oh, okay, well. Like we have Batman in shadow. We can't actually see him, but like, because I'm sure like they didn't want to try to like. I'm sure they wanted to try to avoid things. So, but there's references of like Batman. There's references of Superman. They do all kinds of things in this show, but they don't actually show said people. It's just the reference of them. So like even in this episode, they use like the Animaniacs for some kind of like little shtick in the first episode. So we end up having it to where Freakazoid is, yeah, it's pretty good mint, and so we end up having the sergeant telling the Freakazoid that there is trouble at this dance, and so Freakazoid was like, well. I gotta go there and I gotta check this whole thing out. So we end up bizarrely having like Freakazoid going to this dance, and he ends up doing all kinds of bizarre things. He ends up like going and trying to like do this bizarrish like song thing, but then eventually he like tries to like shush everybody and tells them to like get down on the ground and like all kinds of things. And like we end up having it to where Freakazoid ends up confronting every single girl that had told him Dexter that he was busy. And so we end up having Freakazoid going to, of course, the one girl that mentioned that she was getting something removed. And Freakazoid is like, oh, hey! Like, oh, I completely understand now. Like, what was the thing that you were going to get removed, right? It was your heart, I'm sure. Like, we end up having, like, Freakazoid, like, yelling at every single person. And it's like really just like it feels very much Ryan Reynolds or like Jim Carrey, or like it kind of feels in that ballpark of him just yelling that way. And so we go along and eventually have Freakazoid having to confront this cave guy. And so we have it to where eventually like cave guy ducks from underneath the cave guy between his legs, and then just kind of like shimmies underneath cave guy, and we end up having Freakazoid knowing the color of cave guy's underwear, which is brown. Like, hey guys, he has underwear that's brown. And so we eventually have it to where after all this kind of build up, we end up having Freakazoid on top of this like basketball hoop, and to where like cave guy is like dragging the basketball hoop down, and Freakazoid is trying to push the basketball hoop up. So we end up having this back and forth struggle to where eventually it ends up to where there was a wind up here to where eventually the cave guy ends up getting like smashed with this basketball hoop, and to where that's how Freakazoid just ends up defeating seemingly his foe of this episode. Which I just thought, I was like, wait a minute, what? I'm like, that's how you defeat your villain of the episode? I'm like, say what now? And then eventually we end up having Freakazoid getting the cave guy arrested, and then eventually he ends up in the arms of one of the girls that he likes regardless, and he'll forgive her of anything. And then eventually he turns back into Dexter, and then the hot girl is just like, well, hey, like, where did Freakazoid go? And then she like turns around, and then Dexter turns back into Freakazoid, and then they kiss again. Uh, and yeah, just a very interesting and bizarre-ish like episode, which I thought was really fun. We have Handman, or yeah. So what ends up happening is in this portion of this, so we end up doing these like sidekick chronicles, and so we end up having Handman, who is actually just like Freakazoid's like actual like hand. So he's like ma ma hey ma 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 like it's an actual his actual hand is Freakazoid's own hand is actually his sidekick for the first episode. And I'm like, oh my god, this is so goofy. And so we end up having Handman fighting this guy named the Lobe. And so the entire time the Lobe is thinking, it's like, oh my god, this I can't really be fighting a guy that has a side his hand for his sidekick. There is no way that this is going to work. And so we end up having the Handman tricking the Lobe into like the Handman was gonna like try and tell him a secret, and so the Lobe was like, okay, sure, like what's the secret? And so Handman like has him get closer and closer and closer till eventually the secret is that like he's basically going to get punched. And so Handman just keeps like punching him repetitively until eventually the Lobe, who is just a man with a brain for a face, uh, eventually ends up falling over and ends up getting hit with all this stuff, which is to basically take him down. And so we end up finding out that Handman eventually has a wife, which is, of course, Freakazoid's other hand. And so we end up having Handman and I guess Handwoman eventually getting married. There's a whole ceremony for that. And so they end up going off on their honeymoon. And so we end up having Handman and Handwoman going off and making out. And so we end up pulling back, and it's Freakazoid who says, like, man, like, uh, I wish that this relationship would be going as well uh, as Feet Man and Feet Woman. And then eventually we end up finding out that, like, bizarrely, Freakazoid's feet also are a couple, and it's so bizarre. It's such a weird thing, but it doesn't end there. So let's move on. I'm sure there's probably stuff that I'm going to skip around about, or there's stuff that I'm going to probably deem unimportant. But there's a lot of stuff going on in these episodes, so I'm going to try to tailor as much as I can to not make this like a 20-hour review of this. So in the next episode, we end up having Freakazoid going with his girlfriend Steph to watch over these kids at some camp. And so we end up having them telling ghost stories, and they're trying to tell the most hilarious ghost stories where like one person ends up saying like, well, yeah, like, and you wouldn't have noticed, but the entire time that whole thing was a piece of wood. And everybody's like, oh. And so in this entire episode, during this section of it, every time the episode mentions that if they slap the word scream on the screen, like, you have to scream along with anybody that is going to be screaming in this episode. Because every single time somebody like screams, like I guess you're supposed to scream, but why would you want to do that? Especially if you're like watching this on some streaming thing somewhere, people are like, "Dude, you're weird." But anyways, so we end up having it to where, like, funny enough, the person's like, "Yeah, and the thing was wood all along." I'm like, "Oh, ooh, that was scary." And so eventually we have some girl telling some other story, some other ghost story, and it seems to really not be going that well. People are kind of losing interest. And so we have her saying, and yeah, but the entire time we found out he was a piece of wood the whole time. And everyone's like, ooh, that's scary. So she like recycled the same ghost story towards the end there just to like get everybody riveted. So we we eventually have it to where eventually Freakazoid goes up and he's like, well, yeah, like all these ghost stories were really good, but if anything, like nothing is ever going to be as scary as having Sinbad getting another TV show, and everyone was like, ooh, no, no. So Sinbad is a stand up comedian that like there's quite a bit of this that seems to have been written during a period of time. Like I think at some point, one of the episodes has like Bill Clinton and like Hillary Clinton or whatever in one of these episodes, and like we have like maybe like Princess Diana or something like that. Really, it's just like bizarre. So we end up having at some point that the Freakazoid is breaking character as the narrator is going and narrating. Because we have it to where the Freakazoid is trying to make fun of the narrator consistently. There's one point when the narrator is going on his rant, and we end up having Freakazoid who is treating the narrator like he's some puppet on some string that he himself is orchestrating. And so eventually once the narrator stops, then Freakazoid like jumps off and like goes on to do what he's supposed to do. But in this episode, we end up having Freakazoid who goes on to break the fourth wall and walk on to like hug the narrator and go on to like thank the director and like hug the kids because like man these kids are really good actors, I hope I'll see them again later, and like really like treating this as like the fourth wall breaking moment and whatever and what have you. So they reset and they break down the next moment. So we end up having the kids going to sleep, and we end up having one of the kids go to the other kid to mention like, hey, like, you know what, like that, like I hope what Freakazoid said wasn't going to be true, that Sinbad wouldn't get another TV show. And so we end up having it to where the kids are like, yeah, like, but that's also just as scary as the Candle Jack monster that I heard about. Like, wait a minute, who's Candle Jack? And like another kid's like, well, wait a minute, like we should not be saying Candle Jack so frequently, because eventually, if we say it, then he'll appear. But then they realize how many numerous times that they've said this character's name, to where eventually we have Candle Jack who ends up showing up, and every single time someone ends up saying this guy's name, he ends up just bizarrely just roping them up and like holding them there. And eventually we have it to where Candle Jack, the more every time somebody says his name, the more he's like, dude, I gotta get more rope. Like, that's all that he does, is he collects people and ropes them up, and like that's all he does. but that's so horrifying. So we end up eventually having, uh, I think, Freakazoid has to know eventually that Candle Jack is happening. And I think eventually the sergeant goes and takes him on some uh, like festival of sorts. And so we end up having them having like good eats and all kinds of things. And we end up having the sergeant like bust in and say like, "Hey, like Candle Jack is really attacking the camp. Like you should go and do something about that." And Freakazoid is like, "Yeah, I think I should." Like I think Freakazoid ends up like mentioning to Steph. It's like, well, yeah, like if anything, things are just kind of like as annoying as like you getting like things in between your teeth. So we have Freakazoid who goes and tries to figure out a way to get rid of this Candle Jack. Because eventually, once he says the name, he and Steph ends up getting roped up together. But eventually, we end up having. Because Freakazoid is so absurdly strong that he can kind of basically do anything. Like him getting blown up or shot up or whatever is like nothing. To where eventually we end up having also Freakazoid uh, like cutting the ropes with just his hands and like throwing the rope off to the side. And so we end up having Freakazoid bizarrely concocting this cage uh, to hold Candle Jack. And I think we have some um, guy that kind of busts in and starts to have like this bit of dialogue, and then he ends up saying like, "I think I have a pen in my tuchus, or a pen in my butt." Uh, and I think also one of these episodes we end up having also Freakazoid asking, desperately asking, what does the WB stand for? Does it stand for wide butt? Like, what does it stand for? Like, what does it mean? And so on and so forth. That's freaking hilarious. So we go on and have Freakazoid concocting this cage, and so we end up finding out that the Freakazoid lures Candle Jack into this cage with pumpkin pie. The scent of pumpkin pie alerts Candle Jack to go into this cage, and then we have we end up having Freakazoid shutting the cage, and that ends up solving the puzzle of seemingly this Candle Jack like character. And I was like, God, this is so bizarre. These episodes are so fun, but yet so bizarre. So we go into this bizarrish like thing of Toby Danger in Doomsday Bet. So we end up having a bizarrish family that we don't even know why they are. So we have this family that seems to be investigating a welder guy that had done something villainous. And so we end up having the family flying into town off of some part of land. Like bizarrely, this land is just flying them to where they are, and then eventually the land starts to part ways, and we end up having the family fly in from these like bits of sidewalk, and so we end up having I think Toby Danger mentioning to his cohort, because I don't remember all these names because I don't remember all of them. We end up having Toby Danger mentioning like, well, hey, like this will probably replace cars someday. And it's like, well, yeah, I'm sure it will. So we end up going on and having this family go and find some picture of this this welder guy, and immediately they're just like, well, yeah, like right away I knew exactly that this villain would be would be this guy immediately. And like, so we eventually bizarrely have this villain come in with this gigantic like robot into town, and so we end up having this robot try and take down this family, and eventually we end up having one of the guys of this family end up just throwing a barrel at this robot, and so we end up having the barrel hitting the robot in the perfect spot to completely just take this robot down, and everybody just wins. I'm like, what is going on with this show? This makes no sense, but it's hilarious. Uh, like, I don't even think I'm gonna get into the gnome episode, because that is just like, what even is that? Like, I didn't understand that at all. And plus, like, we had like some gnome god in that episode. Man, was that weird. So moving on, the lobe part of episode 2 wasn't the thing that I said before. This is completely different. We end up finding out the lobe is doing some medical experiment on Freakazoid, and so supposedly Freakazoid is strapped down onto this doctor table, and so we end up having the lobe wanting to see what makes Freakazoid tick. So we end up having the lobe cutting Freakazoid right down the middle, and we end up finding out that Freakazoid within him is a bomb, but also is just another Freakazoid inside of a Freakazoid. And so Freakazoid ends up coming out of his own body, and he ends up giving Loeb a bomb. And so we end up having it to where Freakazoid does the joke of like, well, you wanted to know, like, what makes me tick? Well, there's a bomb right there. And so we end up having Freakazoid grabbing his girlfriend Steph, who is this nurse, and they end up running off to where the lobe ends up getting exploded by this bomb. But the lobe is still going to continue to keep popping up within these episodes. So, moving on. So, in the next episode, we have the bizarre-ish thing where we have Freakazoid who ends up meeting all these political figures. They all want to honor Freakazoid, and they're like, oh my god, like, I can't believe that you're here, and, like, we can honor you, and, like, we end up having the Freakazoid who, like, meets, like, Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton and princesses and all kinds of things, and like everybody is all just like, yeah, like we want to honor you, Freakazoid, we all love you. And so they end up all coming together to eventually, bizarrely, all of a sudden have a alien arrive from the sky. And so this ends up bizarrely happening twice in this episode, where we end up at first having a alien arrive, and evidently this alien is or in his name is the name Moron. And so we end up having it to where this alien is consistently like picking his belly button and like picking his nose, and he just repetitiously just says like that he's a moron. And so we end up having Freakazoid eventually saying like, well, hey, like, how can we talk with this thing? And the Freakazoid is like, well, hey, like, how about we ask him something? And so Freakazoid asks him, it's like, hey, what's 2 plus 2? And the Freakazoid is like, and it's like, yeah, that's what I thought. It's like, yeah. So we eventually have another alien arrive in the same environment some point in this episode, and he ends up asking just what is some name of some bizarre left field thing that somebody just made up a name for, like it was Skippy. And so the alien was like, oh my god, yeah, Skippy. Good, great. And then we end up having the alien going back onto his ship to tell all of his other aliens that it was Skippy, and they're like, "Oh, yeah, that's his name. Oh, okay, cool." And so they end up like taking off. So, like I feel like I'm already missing something here. But anyways, so uh, yeah, I feel like there was a whole other part there. But anyways, we have the sewer rescue. So this is where we set up Lord Bravery. So we end up having a guy that seems to have the family around him wanting to have him go and get a job. And we have Lord Bravery. He's like, well, no, like I have a job. Like it's to monitor this device here that helps me try to find people that are in danger. It's like that's my real job, and so we end up having Lord Bravery eventually going and having this device tell him that he needs to go to this location, and so we end up having this guy yelling, "Help! Help! Help! Help me! Can somebody help me?" And so Lord Bravery ends up going into this location, and then he ends up realizing that it's a sewer. And he's like, oh my god, I'm not going to go in there and save you. Like, no, like, I'm not going to save you in a sewer. And so we end up having Lord Bravery, like, just, like, sending a thing of rope down to this guy because, like, dude, I'm not going to go down there. And we end up having this person that is in desperate need is saying, like, well, like, could you send somebody else here? Like, could you send Superman? And like, Lord Bravery's like, I don't know Superman. And we have it to where the desperate person saying, like, well, what about those turtle guys that wear the bandanas? Like, don't they even like live in a sewer? Like, yeah, I think that they live in a sewer. Like, I'm pretty sure they live in a sewer. And so we end up having Lord Bravery eventually trying to send a rope down to this guy. And so we end up having the guy pulling on the rope and then ends up pulling Lord Bravery into the sewer with this guy. And so we end up uh, having the desperate guy asking, well, like, do you want to call Superman or should I? And so that kind of wraps up that portion of story. But Lord Bravery keeps coming back. There's also another like hilarious episode that I don't know is going to come up again within any of these descriptions, because I think there was one also. I'll just kind of like this is all will just be not in order of every episode. So we eventually have another Lord Bravery episode where he goes to a guy of his, and he ends up finding out that Lord Bravery, the name, has been taken by some bakery. And so Lord Bravery cannot use the name Lord Bravery as his superhero name. And so we have this guy having to concoct like a separate name for Lord Bravery. And so he's like, well, like what else could it be? And he's like Lord Fish and Chips or something like that. And we end up having it to where Lord Brave is like, dude, or like, no, it's like smoked salmon and chips or something. And we end up having Lord Bravey going like, no, like, I'm not going to shout out my war cry of smoked salmon and chips. And no, that's not going to happen. So we end up having this guy mentioning like, well, how about your name be like, Lord Medical Plaza? And so like, Lord Bravery's like, no, like, I will not, like, does that seem like something that would fit, like, this? Like, and so this guy keeps rambling off all these other names that make no sense, and so Lord Bravery's like, dude, I give up. Like, I'm gonna go to this bakery that's called Lord Bravery, and I'm gonna just try to like convince them to change their name. And so we end up having Lord Bravery going to this diner, this place, this bakery, and so he ends up convincing this woman to call her bakery like her name and then the bakery, but she says, well, uh, here's the problem. Like, I will change my name to that, but you also have to talk to the other place that's just down the road that has like the same first name as I do. And so Lord Bravery goes like, oh, okay, well, we have Lord Bravery going down to that place, and so he ends up saying like, well, I'm more than willing to change the name because it wasn't really my name in the first place. Like, I would have liked to have called this place Roy's, and we end up having like Lord Bravery going like, oh, phew, like, yeah, like, thank God, like, we're done with all this. But Roy is like, well, yeah, that's great and all, but like, we also have like another place that is named Roy that I need them to change their name. And then so we end up having it to where eventually Lord Bravery has like 30 different people behind him, and we end up having Lord Bravery going to this one establishment and just saying like, dude, could you please just change your name, please? And we end up having the guy saying like, no, like, I'm not interested. And he's like, no, come on, like, if you change your name to so and so name, then like, these 30 other people all will change their name to this and this and this and this and this and this and this. And so we end up having the guy saying like, well, no, like, I just won't change my name. And then so that ends up having it to where every single one of the other people that all came along with Lord Bravery were all just like, well, I guess that's it. Like, we're not going to change our names then. And so Lord Bravery just ends up giving up, and he's like, you know what? Like, I'm just going to go as Lord Bravery, and that's it. And so we end up having it to where, like, eventually that's just how the little bizarre skit ends. But anyways, so the Legends Who Lunch. That is bizarrely, we end up just having a lot of old superheroes that are all bizarrely like trading stories. Like, one guy is doing an Aquaman joke, where it seems that somebody was having Aquaman's cousin for lunch or something. So we have it to where bizarrely Freakazoid ends up coming into this diner, I guess, as the waiter, or the person like kind of watching over all these superheroes, trying to take care of them. And so we eventually just have all these like old superheroes all trading stories and stuff like that, and like, that's basically all that really happens within this episode, and like within this little skit. And I was just like, okay, like, why was that there? Just to kind of kill time, I guess. uh but anyways, so on to the very next episode, we end up having a fanboy guy that is just enamored once he likes something. And so we end up having this fanboy desperately trying to seek out George Takei, which a lot of people know from the original Star Trek show. And so we end up having this fanboy just enamored with George Takei, to where he is like, to where he stumbles upon him in some local place, and he starts telling him, it's like, dude, I loved Star Trek and I loved all kinds of things about it. and like I know every episode and everything like that. And so we just have this fanboy who is just following George Takei around, and it gets to a point where eventually, like George Takei is just like has no interest in really talking to this fanboy any further, and so he ends up just kind of like walking off. So we have it to where we have Freakazoid who ends up going into some Freakazoid like vehicle, and bizarrely, they stop for a minute to try and sell you on this Freakazoid mobile that they are never actually going to sell you, but they're doing a commercial anyways just to kill time. So we end up having it to where this fanboy immediately sees Freakazoid uh, trying to uh, take down, I think this like armored car or something like that. He ends up trying to like take down some guys that are trying to like steal some kind of truck or something along those lines. And so this fanboy ends up latching on to Freakazoid, and so because we end up having Freakazoid ending up uh, losing yet another sidekick to. I think the sidekick ends up being killed off or something like that in this episode. So we have a fanboy who ends up jumping in. Is like, well, hey, like I'll be your like sidekick. Like I'll do whatever you want me to do. Like I know every single thing about you, Freakazoid, and I've seen all of your episodes, and I've seen everything, and I've like, and so we have Freakazoid who's just like, oh yeah, sure, yeah, whatever. So we eventually have it uh, to where this fanboy is so clingy on the Freakazoid, but then eventually he ends up seeing Mark Hamill into the distance, and then he's like, "Oh my God, that's Mark Hamill!" And so we eventually have this fanboy, like basically like chasing after Mark Hamill, and we just end up seeing like fanboy and Mark Hamill just running off, and that's kind of like how just the episode ends with like this guy just clinging on to certain kind of people and so on and so forth. It's kind of funny episode, but also like it's kind of like a like hey, don't get too attached to these things kind of thing. And so we also have this moment to where I think in one of these episodes, it could be this one, where we end up having this woman repetitiously coming in and saying that no one was hurt in the making of this episode, and then eventually she ends up having a anvil being dropped on her body, and then she's like, "Yeah, even me, I wasn't hurt during the making of this episode." And to where eventually this woman keeps popping into every scene to where eventually she ends up getting hit or hurt by something to where I think eventually she ends up just quitting. Uh, so yeah, so we end up having eventually where uh, Freakazoid has a moment where he teaches us French, where the translation of what he ends up actually saying is uh, that he had cut the cheese, that he basically had farted. It's like, dude, couldn't you have just said farted? But no, he had to say like that he cut the cheese, and so that was the whole like translation, the Frenching with Freakazoid moment. Um, but moving on, so we end up having we have a whole segment bizarrely dedicated to Freakazoid ending up getting a dog for a sidekick. So we end up having Freakazoid fighting, I think, the Milkman or the milk, like the milk. Uh, God, where is it? Doesn't say. Okay, so the Milkman. which bizarrely, like, the end of this guy's gun looks like a baby bottle, and he's like firing it off. So we end up having Freakazoid with a sidekick called Expendaboy or Expendable Boy. And so we end up having it to where Expendable Boy is to just get clocked by Milk, to where I guess eventually Expendable Boy ends up just dying. And so we end up having uh, Freakazoid eventually ending up uh, taking down this milkman guy, and we end up eventually having Freakazoid ending up having to stop uh, this guy who is, I guess, collecting dogs, I guess, from the dog pound. And so we end up having Freakazoid opening the door to this truck or this van or whatever, and we end up having this very vicious dog coming from out of the shadows to the light. And so we end up having Freakazoid calling this dog Foamy. And so what ends up happening is Freakazoid takes Foamy on to being his sidekick, and every single time we just end up having Foamy basically preventing Freakazoid from doing his job. Every single time the villains are doing their job, like they're stealing stuff or whichever, there's like this bizarre woman and this giant snake that were going and stealing things, and Freakazoid ends up trying to run in to try and get them with Foamy. And so Foamy ends up just taking Freakazoid and grabbing him by the legs and just chucking him into the statue repetitiously. And to where eventually, like, that's a bulk of the time what Foamy ends up doing, just taking Freakazoid by the head or by the leg and just repetitiously like knocking him back and forth. Basically, like Hulk in the movie Avengers, where he takes Loki and he just like shucks him back and forth. So we eventually have it to where Freakazoid is strapped to this gigantic looking rocket bomb thing. And so we have it to where Freakazoid is desperately asking for Foamy to help him. And so Foamy does not actually help him at all. And eventually the bomb ends up going off. And eventually we have it to where just Foamy just tries to just hurt Freakazoid, and that's all he really does. So we eventually have Freakazoid that realizes of like, well, you know what? Like, I think that this dog should be like riding off to the sunset and just be done as being my sidekick, because like obvious reasons, like this was just meant to be a short blip of a thing, because we have it to where I guess Freakazoid is in some trophy room somewhere where he is seeing all of his fallen sidekicks one by one, I guess. And so eventually we end up having Foamy, we end up having like Freakazoid remembering this whole story and is telling us now. So we also have this emergency broadcast system, and so really we just have it to where like Freakazoid is like pretending that this is some emergency broadcast system thing, and he ends up like trying to do like all these like annoying sounds and all kinds of things, just to like make fun of the fact that like for this is not really and truly like an emergency broadcast system, but if it was, like they would do all kinds of things. So really, I think that that was probably, and I think they ended up probably doing the gnome thing probably in this last episode, or something along those lines. I think they probably did a couple things here and there. But with that said, yeah, spent an hour talking about this. So yeah, More than likely, there might have been a thing here or there that I forgot about within these episodes. But yeah, I also really enjoyed this show overall. So yeah, I think that's all that I had to say about these 5 episodes. Was really just recantering and whatever about them. There's probably something that I was like, oh yeah, I should have said this and I should have brought up that. But so far, this show is really fun. I really enjoy it, and I can't wait to do other episodes, and hopefully people are interested. So, with that said, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.